All right, so we're running slightly behind time, but I don't think that particularly matters. Let's make a start on our next panel, which is about clinical interventions. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Li Mei Liao, who is recently retired from her role as a consultant clinical psychologist at University College London Hospitals, where she specialised in DSD, on which she's also written numerous groundbreaking papers. With Ian Morland, as we know, Li Mei is the founder of Critical Sexology, so it's a particular pleasure to have her here today. And Li Mei is going to present alongside Dr. Julie Anderson. Julie is consultant clinical psychologist at University Hospitals Bristol and Western NHS FT. She's also the NHS England clinical lead for DSD psychology and social care. So Li Mei and Julie will present together. We'll then turn to Dan Wood, who is a consultant urological surgeon at University College Hospital in London. He has a special interest in adolescent urology, and the majority of his work has been in reconstructive urological surgery. So if we start with Li Mei and Julie, and then pass on to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me well enough? Excellent. Okay. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's really, really special to reconnect with people and to meet new people. I'm not going to live up to the standards of the last two speakers, so, but I'm going to offer a few reflections about Critsex and maybe share a few memories with you. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about how do I move the slides. Sorry, yeah, there we go. About my own experiences of the changes in DSD medicine in the last 20 years. And then how has psychosocial healthcare research responded and what's different about conversations in therapy. So it's a quick gallop through, and then I'd like to just do a little bit of propaganda to announce something new going on in the UK that's really exciting for you to look out for. So I don't want to speak for Julie or Dan, but the three of us work for the National Health Service, and this may be something particular to the UK, and that we are very aware that not every country has a National Health Service, and therefore our capacity to state our opinions and so on is maybe a little bit different from other clinicians in other countries. We, within reason, can critique. I think that we've all had our share of bollocking, but we've quite grown to the Anglo-Saxon, and I'm having withdrawal symptoms, withdrawing from the NHS and missing that kind of feisty conversations that happen in healthcare. So a little bit about Critsex. So this is a picture of the Institute of Child Health in London. And I know what you're thinking, maybe the architect should be arrested. But outside, within this rather, I don't know, average exterior are some lovely meeting rooms in the basement, and including a big lecture theatre. And in 2002, there was a meeting going on, and it was, we thought, the first UK forum for care users and health professionals working in intersex. And there were over 100 attendees, about 2/3 health professionals, and about 1/3 were care users. And the atmosphere was really rather tense, and lots of conversations get started, but things don't get resolved, as they're not meant to in the conference. But it was still really important to talk about things. At one stage, my memory is rather hazy now, there was a discussion about clitoral surgery as a way to manage little girls with big clitorises in swimming pools and what have you. And a very posh voice from the audience suggested that, well, perhaps instead of clitoral surgery, little girls could wear swimming shorts instead. And so rather radical in an audience like that. And at break time, you would have figured out that that person was Ian Morland. I went to visit Ian in the doghouse during the break time, and he said that, well, Li Mei, you know, you said we need to have conversation, so when are we going to do this? Now, I say these things to make myself sound good. I didn't mean to do extra work, but he made me. And so what happened then is that we had a first seminar in this building, which was owned by the Mental Health Trust that employed me at the time. Now, unlike the Institute of Child Health, which doesn't look so good on the outside, but has lovely meeting rooms, Hunter Street Health Centre looks splendid on the outside, but has, you know, pretty dirty, grubby living rooms, meeting rooms. And I'm talking about stained carpet, unwanted furniture piled everywhere, rubbish that doesn't get cleared. And actually on the 14th of June, 2002, when we had that seminar, the windows wouldn't open. As you know, in the UK, we have these sash windows that we're a bit addicted to. And the builders, just their favorite hobby is to paint them, to glue them together with this heavy gloss paint. So I had to open the fire escape, which opened to a metal staircase. And on the landing of that metal staircase was the biggest pile of guano that I had ever seen, and since then as well. So I spent the whole of the seminar trying to suppress, you know, a sort of projectile vomiting. And I have absolutely no memory of what was talked about. There were 6 of us, my trainees who were coerced. They might have failed their clinical placement if they didn't attend. My mentor, Mary Boyle, Holly Carmichael, and Ian and me. And then afterwards, I thought, phew, thank goodness that's all over. And I fulfilled a promise. And Ian said, I think that went rather well. I think it's a goer. So we continued to meet. And then by about 2008, Sarah Crichton and I had got kind of a little bit involved in the field of FGM and also lifestyle labiaplasty. And we thought that wouldn't it be fantastic if we could you know, have a kind of international conference where we bring all these kind of key people together to identify areas of overlap and areas for debate. And that's kind of what happened. And you can see that on the right-hand side, the usual Critsex suspects were all present, being involved. And it was kind of reckless because the 3 of us could have ended up in debtor's prison because we had to sign this contract with the Royal Society of Medicine and would have been stuffed if people didn't register, but they did. And there they are. So on the top right, you have Bo Lawrence wagging her finger at Ian and Lisa because we ran out of wine or something. And then on the bottom left, you have 2 surgeons, and next to them is, I think that's Stephen Whittle, is rather faint. And then next to Stephen, the other side of Stephen, is Milton Diamond. So it kind of shows you how important conversations are and networking is really. So by shortly after that, Ian ran off to Cardiff and I ran out of steam. And we're really, really grateful that Lisa Downing, Meg John Barker and Robert Gillett took over the coordination of critical sexology seminar. And it was these 3 who really brought the seminar to what it is today. And so they're the people who should be wearing the sash, and we can fully expect to see them, with a crown on later. So I'm going to talk about my experiences of changes in intersex medicine. First of all, the term intersex has changed hands, as you know. The concept was redeveloped and tightened up by the same experts who then shortly after that dropped it in 2006. And it was always taken up by people with lived experience. But I think that I get a sense that actually the number of people who are taking up that intersex as an identity, appropriating it, has increased exponentially, but actually is still rejected by more people with lived experiences, if I may be so bold to presume. And the acronym DSD, as you've heard from Ian, has been reworded from disorders to differences of sex development, to diverse sex development, to differences in sex development, and the process is ongoing. And there are other terms, and because I'm talking about medicine, I haven't included them. So these are the kind of changes that in the 25 years or so of my practice that I kind of sense. Now, if you were talking to a different person, they may give you a completely different list of things. So the field has moved from a surgical specialism to a biogenetic field, and there has been an exponential increase in laboratory research in the last 15 to 20 years. And it's interesting that biogenetics are rarely talked about in research and in discussion. And it massively changed our relationships with each other. So there are new and expanded research networks, biodata sharing, such as the IDSD registry, international collaborations, and to me, who've never had any research funding, mouth-watering resources. So the ideal is that every patient has a genetic diagnosis. So diagnosis is no longer made by looking at anatomy, physiology, but a genetic diagnosis is the holy grail. The fantasy is that such a diagnosis predicts human outcomes and eliminates uncertainties. Now that I find really outlandish. It's been quite a while since I was in a health psychology classroom, but from memory, social and economic power is the biggest predictor of human outcomes, and it explains the most of the variance in differences in how well people do. And imaging technology, you've already heard in Ian's talk as well, it's astonishing. These imaging people can pick up the tiniest thing in the pelvis, and which is really, really important for surgeons, because in the adolescent and adult service anyway that I worked in, it's not just about genital surgery. A lot of people come with pelvic pain, there may be some obstruction going on. So having that accuracy, that technology is incredibly helpful. But again, it's one of those things that changes our relationships with each other. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So a lot of these things are not unique to DSD. Okay, so it's really important to bear in mind. So in my department, for example, there are people working in oncology, in fetal medicine, and that is the way that biomedicine is going. Genetics, molecular research, frontier medicine. The idea is that, the holy grail is that if you can get a genetic diagnosis, then, we would know that who's going to get cancer, who's at risk, and we can eliminate those risks. So biotesting has absolutely intensified and reified. It cannot be challenged, okay? So, it's pretty solid, these things. And I would say clustering of different disciplines, a larger and larger number of disciplines, and mainly pediatric endocrinology led or driven. So it's not surgically driven. That's important to acknowledge that. And I haven't said the word MDT because different disciplines being in the same room doesn't make it a team. A team is a group of people who know each other's names, each other's roles, and whose work is interdependent on each other towards an agreed outcome that is negotiated. And that doesn't happen in DSD. So truth-telling of the diagnosis and treatment is now just standard. And I've noticed more male assignment for newborns, and that there's an understanding that gender reassignment in adolescence or adulthood is not a failure of the original assignment. It's not that we've got the true sex wrong. So that isn't part of the culture anymore. And there is an acceptance of non-heterosexual, non-binary embodiment. People do come in, you know, and want to experiment with hormones and what have you, and actually clinical teams are quite permissive. But I think there are caveats to that. And so what hasn't changed is that the uncertainties and dilemmas, if anything, have increased. So more knowledge, more biodata gathering hasn't actually made health professionals and parents more at ease, more confident about what they're doing, and quite the opposite. So the clinical protocols are pathology-based, and that we only have that sex dimorphic language to talk to patients because we are part of the culture that we live in. And the performative effects of medicalizations are unexamined. And actually it's really, really difficult to raise that. When I go and give talks and what have you, people sort of scratch their head. Because it's a little bit like, you know, doctors have to do what other doctors do. It's not kind of like they can't just make up their own protocol. It's a little bit like you live in a borough where, you know, you have to build all the houses in brick, and then, you know, you're raising issues like, well, the houses should be built in other materials, and it kind of doesn't make sense. This is all set. The scene is kind of set for clinical teams to adopt. Well, that's how it feels. And there's a misconception of psychological contributions, and thank you, Ian, for that, a very cathartic comment, the burden of critique. I have certainly experienced it, even in my own team, because it's just really, really difficult to integrate the different knowledge bases and to find a language to communicate across. So, and typically there isn't enough time. So socially motivated childhood genitoplasties are more or less unchanged, I think, from the kind of latest papers that I've read. So if you were to go to a DSD scientific meeting, you're going to be exposed to a lot of this kind of presentations, new discoveries, which makes it really, really difficult to then, you know, to know, you know, how to kind of integrate these different layers of knowledge. And we ended up with the division of labor that Ian referred to in his talk. So this is an excerpt from the paper, you know, when Katrina Rowan was the interviewer. She asked, what's the point of having a psychologist involved here? And the interviewee said, okay, that's where my ignorance comes out. Now, teams don't have people who don't know each other's roles or even names sometimes in the transcripts. So that's a bit of a hard sink, and that's a hot potato for people who come after me to pick up. So what about psychosocial health research? And so I think, you know, some psychosocial health researchers and clinicians were really rather alarmed that the only place to have a dialogue with each other is through these medical conferences. So there were attempts to create our own research networks where we could have conversations, collaborations, and peer learning. And there has been an increase in local and national research projects, but actually there are some examples now of international collaborations, such as DSD Live, it's the SENSE project that you've heard about, a smaller study, more focused study, looking at German-Israelis comparative study. And of course, a new project based at Huddersfield, India is starting, which is really, really exciting. So from the couch, what are the themes? Have the themes changed in terms of these conversations with hundreds of people over the years? I don't know how to make that work in PowerPoint, so I drew it out. So just very quickly, the staple in therapeutic conversations is, I mean, I call it disclosure, just in honor of the patients that I saw early on in my career. When I asked them what was the most important thing for me to make sense of, and they said disclosure. By that they meant talking about intersex, talking about the XY chromosomes. And another kind of big theme is normalizing interventions. I have done a lot of, talking with adolescents and adults about, surgery to so-called enhance secondary sex characteristics like breast augmentation, vaginoplasties, and sexual experiences, identities that you would predict those. But actually, a lot of what psychologists do is dealing with some generic mental health issues that are not particularly directly related to the DSD. It just could be that, they've come from a background where the parents have had mental health difficulties and what have you. Now, what's disappeared from the map, more or less, are the kind of secrets and lies, that I heard a lot about early on in my career, and the experience of objectification, of kind of, so these would be people who didn't know the diagnosis, and they might ride a bicycle and have a sprained ankle, and then they would go to the doctor and they were told to take all their clothes off. And it's only with hindsight when they realized the diagnosis that they understood why, because on their notes would be recorded that they were, a pseudo hermaphrodite and what have you, and that there was a level of professional voyeurism going on, and it was very, very distressing for people. And actually, in those early years, people who heard about there being a psychologist specializing in the area would make some sort of pretext that, oh, I'm going to visit London anyway, and can I meet you? And they just wanted to talk about their experiences, about how shocking it was to find out about their diagnosis in midlife or even beyond. And so those conversations have disappeared for quite a while now. They talked about peer support, and I did a lot of work preparing people for peer support encounters, which still are highly emotional. And then, of course, the support group resource sort of dwindled. And actually, in recent years, people have gone abroad to engage with peers. People have come from the AISDSD meetings in the United States, really buoyant and, and so excited that it would take them weeks to digest the experience and to come down. So there's an absolute sort of, strong need for peer support. And that leads me on to a little bit of propaganda. So a new group is starting, providing, well, in due course, I suppose, face-to-face support for people with intersex variations, across the board, not diagnosis specific. And two intersex persons, Magda Rakita and Anik Soni, have really worked their socks off to bring this about. And I hope that those of you who are based in the UK would engage with them, with this group, which I have high hopes for. So that's all from me. Thank you.
So I think we're handing straight over to Julie.
Julie, you're muted.
There we are. Hello. I'm trying to share. And from the beginning. Hello, everyone. I've got 10 slides, so I'm just going to be quick. I'm trying to get rid of my view that shows everything on my screen. Feel free to jump in with advice for me here, anybody. Slideshow.
It's slideshow, just the up a bit.
Okay, so
up to the next menu, up to the top. So you've got file, home, insert, design, transitions, animations, and then slideshow. If you click on slideshow, it should give you the show full screen option.
No, I'd done that. I've done that. Okay, slideshow not showing.
Oh,
from the beginning. You know what? I might just do this. It's probably not worth it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Shall I carry on? Okay. Okay. So I just want to just say a bit just about what's happening in the UK at the moment with regard to service development in the NHS. So just to say, for people outside the UK, there's a National Health Service, and health services are run by locality of the United Nations of the United Kingdom. So I'm talking about England, but there's an expectation that that'll be influential across the UK. So there's my slideshow. So just to say, oh no, if I do this, I've got all this background stuff. That's uncool. Anyway, I'll go and persevere. I'm sorry. So just to say, this began with activism. And activism and journalism came to the attention of NHS organisers and NHS commissioners in the way that clinicians who had been talking about difficulties for many, many years and poor services had been ignored. You see, I'm talking, but I haven't quite given up on the idea of getting rid of my things from current slideshow. No, I'm like some sort of person stuck in a snare. Okay, so NHS England have been working since 2018 and hopefully be finished in 2021, but I have to put a question mark there, to revise paediatric care for people with intersex conditions or DSD, and also to establish a policy statement about what surgery will be commissioned. So I want just to highlight this for you today, because many of you who are listening will be stakeholders and hopefully would have something to say to NHS England about this. So what's happened so far is that NHS England have drafted and have proposed a surgery policy, and that is out and live at the moment for anybody to comment on who considers themselves a stakeholder. And the way to do that, I'll talk about it a bit here, but it's, Lisa kindly put it on the Critsex website. So you would be able to go on there, have a look and make a comment if you'd like. Afterwards, after this stage, the policy will be reviewed and then there will be a public consultation. So if you think about what's been happening in the States in terms of certain hospitals saying that they're going to stop certain surgeries, I can tell you that around the UK, some hospitals and some services, some teams have stopped and changed their practice in recent years along these lines. But now we're looking at a nationwide commissioning-based change that's being proposed. So we've got some lovely quotes and headlines here from the States. And this week we had a lovely sedate headline in the UK: surgery on intersex children may stop. And today so far there was 115 online comments about that article that was out this week. And this is where we are at the moment. Of course, just as with the Boston Children's Hospital and the hospital in Chicago, is not all surgery, but this is what we're looking at. So I'm just going to summarize a proposal for you and say how you can join in with views. So the proposal for England, it is saying that surgery basically won't be available in absence of an individual's consent or there being a high risk of cancer. So the quick way we've been saying it and been talking to people recently is no early genital surgery without consent or cancer. It's a bit crass, but it kind of sticks. Oops, see, this is very bad. So the policy is talking about gonadal surgeries, that's a removing of gonads, and surgery to change the appearance and some people would say function of genitals in childhood. They're saying this proposal is that this would not be routinely available until the individual is able to consent to treatment for themselves. So there's been much talk since this proposal has come out about who can consent, of course, and consent to medical treatment for children, is an issue in lots of domains, but this actually specifies that consent has got to be made by the individual themselves. And of course, as with any other kind of surgery, if there's an emergency or there's a risk of a malignancy, then that is an exception. So at the moment, any of us can respond via this email address as stakeholders if we have a view to contribute. So I just wanted to let you know that it's not an onerous task. Oh, I'm so sorry. These are mainly the 4 questions that are on the consultation. It basically says, do you support the proposal? The proposal as I've summarized earlier. Do you support the proposal? Any additional information? What do you think are the positives or negatives? And would you have any other comments? Now here on the feedback form, it says no more than 500 words, but don't let that hold you back. Can you hear the raining on my roof? Don't let that hold you back. And people have already sent in emails and attachments and all sorts of things. I am safe here. So once this is open until the 4th of December, and I just wanted to say to you, please don't be shy. As I'm sure many of you have, if you've got something to say about early infant surgery for intersex children, now is a great time to say it. You won't be surprised to hear that there are many different views, and you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of different stakeholders are getting very organized and are submitting impassioned opinions. So a whole range of views. It would be great to have a range of views, and it'd be very, very sad if we only had predominantly a strong medical voice. Once stakeholders, successful, how do you spell that? Once we've heard from stakeholders, we'll be going through those processes of revising and reviewing again, and then proposing to NHS England what happens. But just to say, parallel to a cessation in early surgery, there's arguably a larger piece of work that's going on in developing paediatric care, shoring up networks of professionals who work together, sometimes in a team way, sometimes less so. And there is some England-wide investment that's going to be going into improving services and having decent standards around patient service user involvement, feedback, and I'm trying to think of a sort of less medical term for key performance indicators, quality standards, and standards by which the services can be measured. And this little slide at the end tells me that I'm finished. Okay, so I'm very, very sorry that I couldn't quite do a screen share, but there we are.
Thank you very much, Julie. So shall we move swiftly on to Dan, who I think is going to screen share?
Okay, can you hear me? Great, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a really fascinating couple of hours to have the luxury of sitting and listening to a range of views and some truly important perspectives that actually we don't, in my world, get to hear every day. But I think the position of surgeons and surgery is precarious. And so in thinking about this, this was the title I came up with. And it's a reflective title rather than a pejorative title. And I hope that what I'll give you in this talk is just a reflection of where we are with surgery, perhaps where we have been, and maybe where we hope to go. No conflicts of interest. I think what this afternoon has very poignantly illustrated is that there are major challenges in this area, and they're challenges that we all face. But I think that as clinicians, we have to be very humble. We have to acknowledge that many of us, or many of our colleagues, have been very slow to acknowledge and engage with this discussion in a productive way. And that we need to think very differently about how we go forward from here. And I've said publicly to my colleagues that I think the surgical management of this range of differences, disorders, diagnoses was a car crash that was waiting to happen. And as surgeons, we failed to spot that, I think. I've added this slide this afternoon in response to some of the I think really interesting and productive comments that have been made. And it's a little bit naughty of me to say, and I realise it's naughty and it's certainly not intended as facile, but as surgeons, we're humans before we're doctors. Being a surgeon is a huge part of my life, but it doesn't define my life. I am a human first and foremost, which means I care, I worry, I think, and I learn, like many of my colleagues. But at each stage of that, I'm a guest. So I'm a guest as a student. I was a guest at college. I was invited, but I was a guest. I was a guest in my training, and I'm a guest where I am now. And I'm a guest in people's lives who ask me to help them. And I do my very best in that. But I think if as medics, clinicians, doctors, surgeons, we try and remember that, I think our interactions and the way that we behave towards our patients will perhaps be better. I try and teach trainees that when they become a bit bolshy at work, to remember that they're a guest where they work, that they're there because they've been asked to be. There are lots of considerations, and many of them have been raised. But there's a wide spectrum of diagnoses that we're asked to be involved in managing, but there's a wide range of practice, and we all know that, that much of the work has been carried out historically by individuals, perhaps not working within a specialist centre, perhaps not working in a structured team, and perhaps lacking some of the knowledge that we have now that allows us to be perhaps more standardised in the way that we, from a medical perspective, make an assessment. You have to remember that I treat adolescent and adult patients. And so what I see, the results of what I see, are 15 years out of date. So the treatment that somebody will have had when they were 1 or 2, and I see them when they're 16 or 17, may be very, very different now. And in writing this talk, I really wanted to think a little bit about what influences me or us, and how we use that to go forward. I think as doctors, we are terrified of a disaster that drags us into the media, and the media has been alluded to, history has been alluded to, John Money's been alluded to, and you'll know that some of his work is referred to in at least one of these books. We do need structure in terms of how, from a medical perspective, we safely approach patients, and somebody referred to outcomes in the conversation earlier, in terms of how we give some meaning to outcomes in terms of what we see. There are lots of ways that we could structure it. I completely accept that, but we need some convention in order for us to be safe, to give meaning to that, and to be effective. But we also need to remember that we are influenced by many, many things. And I mean we as doctors. We should be most significantly influenced by patients or their parents in terms of how we help with making a medical decision. But we're also influenced by outcome data, we're influenced by the media, we're influenced by colleagues, we're influenced by the age of a patient and their ability to participate in decision making, we're influenced by where we work, we're influenced by culture, all sorts of external agencies. They work with us most of the time to help us in how we make decisions. We see a lot of change at the moment, and that's important change, and it's important for us to recognize change, to look at how we interact with that change and how we work productively with all the agencies that we serve to make the best of that change. I'm quoting a paper that Lee May and I were both co-authors on, published 10 years ago, and it acknowledges a poor history. But actually, we mustn't be too damning of that, because from where we were, we came to where we are. I was interviewed on the television a few years ago in relation to a particular patient of mine who'd written a book, and I was ambushed about the decisions that were made. And I was asked, would we ever make those decisions again? And my response was that I couldn't promise we wouldn't make those decisions again, but that if those decisions were made, that they would be made with support rather than a surgeon being in isolation, and with disclosure, with full information, and with support of a team of professionals around them. It was a difficult conversation, but I felt that that was a sensible and balanced answer. There are decisions that we wouldn't make again. We don't remove genitals now, but we do work much more consensually, I think, both with other professionals and with our patients. It's important to think about what we think we know. We think that patients who've had surgery may have bad outcomes from the point of view of sexual function, and it's important to have that in our discussion. How should we as surgeons measure an outcome? The question's been asked or mentioned about outcomes earlier in the discussion, and it's a really challenging and important question for us to measure. These are data published from Indiana, I think, about early cosmesis. But look at the bottom, look who's making the judgments about that, and decide for yourselves whether you think those are the right people to be making those judgments. But these are published data that are out there, and we need to contextualize that and think about how we integrate that into our practice for the future. These are further data about patients who've made decisions with clinicians to have their child operated on early in life. And the question is about decisional regret. I asked a question of the author at one of the meetings that I saw this presented at, and said, you know, how do you expect patients to regret a decision they've made when they can't really see the outcome? They've made something that they thought was the right choice for their child on the basis of the influences that they've had. So it's really challenging to look at this data and say this is right, or indeed that it's wrong, but it's data that are, or those are data that are out there. This is in the context where we're presented with very deliberate surgical challenges. I'm just going to warn everybody who's watching that there are just some surgical slides here that I'm just presenting as part of a context. If you don't wish to see them, I would look away for a couple of minutes just now. But we're asked to think about whether we preserve gonads. We're asked to think about how we change techniques and adapt surgery when patients do ask us to do things specifically. We're asked to develop new techniques to improve the outcomes that we offer. We're asked sometimes to deal with very difficult and challenging clinical scenarios to make sure that we deliver the outcomes that a patient might expect. And we're also asked to deal with the aftermath of previous surgery that at times can be difficult and challenging. So we're also thinking constantly about who we should worry about. this is just a slide, it's very busy, but it shows us a grid of how we might think about malignancy risk in retained gonads across a range of diagnoses. Many of these are made on, based on data where gonads will have been removed very early in life. And so if we're talking about challenges where we're asked to preserve gonads for a range of different reasons, how do we then ensure that we are following an individual up safely and make sure that we are not endangering life by trying to support a patient's wishes? We're asked to think about how we can reconstruct things, and there's no doubt that surgical techniques have moved on. They've improved enormously, but it's about also doing that in the context of realizing expectations. We can use a number of surgical techniques for creating and improving genital function. So why do we worry? You know, all that, if you present that to a medical audience, sounds terribly clever. But there are lots of humbling aspects to it and things that I think we do need to reflect upon. This meeting was referred to, and actually we looked at the change in practice since that meeting. And actually we found that the proportion of surgery hadn't changed very much at all, despite that being one of the proposed outcomes of that consensus meeting. And so that's disappointing. But we also see that there is a shift in the severity of surgery needed. So perhaps that points to an improvement in technique, even if the surgery itself or the numerical or the number of surgeries has not changed very much. We learn that patients come to us under in all kinds of guises, referred by all sorts of specialties, but we also learn that the importance of working closely with psychologists and understanding how much they are capable of drawing out of a patient, that we as surgeons have to acknowledge our weaknesses in doing so. It is truly important. And there were all sorts of really cogent points made earlier in the discussion, particularly by Ian and Peter, about the power that clinicians have in that relationship. And I think that some of the points I've made earlier hopefully go to a reflective way of thinking about how we might interact better. Reference was made to lessons in Anglo-Saxon. When we published this, it was designed to be provocative. It was designed to engender a discussion about the need for a non-surgical pathway in caring for patients who may be being offered cosmetic genital surgery. One of my colleagues phoned me and I had a 45-minute lesson in Anglo-Saxon upon publication of this paper. We mustn't be afraid from within and without the surgical fraternity to challenge current paradigms, and that happens. Some of those conversations are not easy, and you can understand why people are territorial about their work, why they want to preserve their practice, and those are reasons that are perhaps inwardly rather than outwardly focused, but they are nonetheless reality. And in having these conversations, we have to develop ways of bringing people to the table rather than pushing them away. But we know the basis of why we do this, and we know the basis of why, as surgeons, we should worry about it. But we also know that we have lots of questions to answer, that when we look at these data about sexual dysfunction, that there's never been a control group that gives us realistic outcomes as to what would happen if we didn't operate. How different would these outcomes be if we didn't? And so it's about balancing that challenge to give data that help us be more robust in forming a practice going forward, or reforming a practice perhaps. We know these, and I'm not going to dwell on them now. But we worry about things like malignant risk. We worry about that if we don't intervene, that there will be unintended consequences of not doing so, and that may affect some of the things, the very things that we're trying to prevent. And we need to be wary that a lack of intervention isn't just as powerful or as dangerous as intervention itself. So there is a moral balance to be struck, or a medical balance to be struck, however you want to look at it, about the rights and wrongs of when and how we should intervene. We need to think about well-being. We need to, as I've said right from the start, be hugely influenced by patient preference, and we need to make sure that we follow up our patients so that we can understand and interpret the outcomes of what we've done. I accept what's been said earlier, and it was a really interesting way to reflect on how an MDT may influence us, our decisions, and the relationship with our patients. I really valued that. But at the moment, it's a much better place that we're in terms of decision making than we were 15, 20 years ago, when some of these practices were really just forming by surgeons who were really trying to innovate and really trying to do what they thought was important in terms of taking practice forward. We do work in a different way now, and I think that's incredibly important. We may get better at using the MDT and altering that power dynamic that's been referred to, but it is a much better place that we're in now than we were a few years ago. So where does that leave us? I think we don't know. What's the indication for surgery? Well, there does need to be a clear surgical imperative. And in recognizing that, how do we achieve a sensible debate about it, where people are less territorial, less defensive, and more open to change and true innovation, as opposed to stepwise innovation? It's important that we understand the true instance of surgery. It's important that we think about the long-term effects. I've chosen fertility there as an example. That will be more or less important to some, but it's an important consideration that we try and offer. Is parental consent enough? Well, I think that debate has progressed almost since I've written this slide, with the outcome of the white paper that's we've just seen presented. And how in that context should we think about introducing new surgical procedures that we believe may be better in the future? So these are some of my thoughts, that that everyone around the table needs to engage and stay engaged. That at the moment, it would be wrong to think with anybody as a victor, that nobody is winning, and that from a surgical point of view, this is now a salvage mission, that we need to draw ourselves out of the flames and make sure that we're at the table and offering a sensible and balanced opinion to the debate. I think that surgery probably does remain important in some contexts, but only with a surgical imperative. It's really important to remember, and I've said it many times very publicly, that surgeons cannot make normal, and that operating for the first time is always easier than revising surgery because of scar tissue, etc. So no one's right. At the moment, an MDT is essential. Long-term outcomes are really difficult, but they're important, and we need to get better at that. Counselling and consent to risk are vital, and psychology, amongst the many things that we offer, is vital. I'm very grateful for your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and to Li-Mei and Julie for 3 very engaging and thought-provoking papers. We're not doing great for time, but I do want to take a few questions now before we take a very short break, I think, and then move into the final panel of the day. So I have 2 questions in the Q&A box. The first one is for Julie. And the question is the stakeholder feedback limited to the UK, or can people outside of the UK respond? So this is about the consultation that you introduced to us.
It is not limited, and yes, please, we'd like to hear from people with experience and views from outside of the UK. It's this stakeholder phase is different from a public consultation. When the next stage, when there's a public consultation, that'll be for the people with general practice, family doctors in England. So it'll be really quite limited to English people. But now, at the moment, no. If you have experience and if you have knowledge from other places, then we'd really like to hear that too.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So a question for Dan. What makes it hard to challenge the surgical fraternity?
Surgeons. I mean, that's really the bottom line. We've made it difficult for ourselves, I think. But there are subtleties to that. Lee May highlighted the value of working within the NHS in this country. We don't have a fee per service environment, and that should have a number of advantages. It should mean that we can afford to be less protectionist about our practice, because we won't suffer a loss of income if our practice shifts from one person to another. But as I said right at the start, surgeons are humans first, and they care and they want to look after patients to the best of their ability. But I think to a degree, some people have lost themselves in the historic debate, believing that perhaps they are the best and only person that can offer care to people. Surgery is modernizing, and I think we will see less of that. I'm grateful that we'll see less of that. I think that environments where there is a fee per service environment, so surgeons are paid for what they do, may make some of these changes harder for them to accept. But that doesn't make them more or less right. The debate is ethical and moral, and we have to fit in and make sure that the care that we offer is compatible with that environment.
Okay, great. I have another question for Dan. This is going to be a big discussion this time that we don't really have space for it, but let's do it anyway. Julie, go on.
I was just going to quickly say that in following on from what Dan said, it's my observation that in the UK, at least in children's services, we are shifting from trying to get the best possible cosmetic outcome, which has been a sort of a surgical outcome, to an emphasis on the least possible intervention. So I do see that shift. So I think we're challenging surgeons, and surgeons are welcoming being challenged in different parameters. So in the past, I've heard people say, well, if I could just go in again, I could make it look better. But that's I'm hearing that less and less and less now. We're talking about what's the best outcome in terms of the least possible medical or that'll surgical, and also it's following on medical intervention.
Thank you. So I think what I'm going to do, we have 3 questions in the Q&A panel. I think I'm going to take one more question because it's specifically for Dan about a point in his paper. The other 2 by Mitchell and Hannah, if they will permit, I'd like to save them for the end because they seem to be opening up sort of broader questions. So if Elliot could field those 2 questions as part of the discussion at the end. So I think the last question we'll be able to take for this session, Dan, bearing in mind Peter's comments on the relevance of framing for modifying public opinion, with reference to the current NHS consultation, which Julie outlined, will the medical profession be making any public statements about the value and necessity of this consultation?
I thought that point was extraordinarily powerful from Peter. I think it's something that we all intrinsically know, but actually it was really beautifully illustrated. The answer is, to the question, I don't specifically know whether the medical profession as a whole will make a public statement. I imagine there will be something that is said. I don't represent the medical profession. What you've heard is my interpretation of the current status, and the answers to the questions that I'll give will be exactly that. but I don't know whether there will be a wider statement that the medical profession will make.
Thank you. I wonder then if we might again thank our participants, our speakers in this session for really fascinating papers. And if we may take perhaps a 5-minute break this time, return at 5:20. And if I could ask my fellow respondents if we perhaps confine ourselves to 5 minutes rather than 10 minutes each for our comments, if that's okay, just so that we stick more or less to schedule. They're already slightly behind. Thank you. So reconvene in 5. Thanks very much.